trust me, I get it. You're feeling the pressure to keep your faith separate from your work, worried that pursuing your God-given dreams might be seen as selfish or misguided. Here's what I've discovered. Our faith isn't a liability in our leadership. As a matter of fact, it's the source of our strength and wisdom. The real challenge is navigating how to boldly pursue our purpose while staying anchored in our faith. And that's exactly what the Beacon Show is all about. Each week, we bring you biblical wisdom and practical strategies from true beacons, Christian leaders who are illuminating the world. And it's also that you can let your light shine brighter and brighter. I'm Tamara Jackson, and this is The Beacon Show. From the cornfields of Indiana to the streets of Detroit, my friend Chris Lambert's journey really speaks to the power of radical obedience and the unexpected places that God can lead us. Once a fraternity brother with dreams of real estate fortune, Chris now stands at the helm of Life Remodeled, an organization that's not just changing neighborhoods, but redefining what urban renewal can look like when it's driven by faith, humility, and a commitment to community. Chris's story is a masterclass in divine detours. It's a tale of how spiritual awakening in Australia led to a mud hut in Africa, which in turn paved the way for transformative work in America's largest predominantly Black city. But more important than that, it's a story of a leader willing to confront his own limitations, challenge his assumptions, and continually evolve in pursuit of greater impact. Today, we dive deep into the mind of a man who's raised, get this, over $50 million for Detroit neighborhoods, has mobilized over 82,000 volunteers, and turned abandoned schools into thriving community hubs. We'll explore how Chris navigated the delicate balance of being a white leader in a predominantly Black city, and how this journey led him to develop a revolutionary approach to nonprofit management. From the messy early days of Life Remodeled to development of a system now used by hundreds of organizations worldwide, Chris's journey offers invaluable insights for anyone looking to bridge the gap between ambitious vision and effective execution in the nonprofit world. So prepare to be challenged, inspired, and perhaps even transformed as we unpack the lessons learned from a life lived all in for the kingdom. This is Chris Lambert's story, which speaks to what can happen when we dare to dream God-sized dreams and have the courage to pursue them, one remodeled life at a time. Enjoy. All right. Well, Chris, welcome to the Beacon Show, where wisdom meets faith and success finds its voice. It's been my honor, just the few minutes that we've been spending together before we officially hit the button, getting to know you and the mission that God has you on. So thank you for giving your time to our viewing and listening audience today.
It is a pleasure and an honor, and I'm looking forward to spending this time together with you, Tam.
Well, let's do it. I am, as you know, because I was kind of filling you in on some of the things that I observed as I was doing my research on you, the things that God has allowed you to accomplish and your heart to now take what you've learned and help others. It is amazing. I am curious. I'm always curious of how people grew up and what they saw for themselves at a young age. So would you mind if we started there? Can you tell us a little bit about who Chris was growing up?
I grew up in a very small town and in northern Indiana. And when I say small town, I mean we didn't have a four-way stoplight until I was in middle school. All right. So the words urban neighborhood revitalization, those were three words I never heard in succession as a child. And so it's pretty wild that that's the work that I'm doing now. But long story short, I went to Indiana University. I studied business. My plan was to go to law school and become a real estate developer because my ambition at the time was to make as much money as I possibly could to live the lifestyle I thought I wanted. And real estate development was, in my mind, a great way to do that. My junior year of college, I moved to Australia for 6 months to study overseas. There wasn't a lot of
Air
studying.
quotes.
I ended up experiencing what I would call a radical encounter with God while I was there that changed the entire trajectory of my life. And before I left Indiana University to move to Australia, there wasn't a single Jesus follower or Christian in this entire fraternity that I lived in of 180 guys. Before I got back to IU for my senior year, this had nothing to do with me. This was all a God thing. My three best friends in the fraternity also had these crazy encounters with God, plus my drug dealer, who was an atheist before I left. I got back. We all looked at each other, said, "What happened to you?" And we all knew. And we got this Bible study going in the frat. And after a few weeks, we started leading tons of guys to Jesus. And we had about 12 to 15 guys coming every week after about 3 or 4 weeks. And I started thinking about my future, and I realized I don't want to become a real estate developer. That's just about me trying to make a bunch of money and prove myself and to the world. I just want to help people connect with God. I felt like he was calling me to be a pastor. So I canceled law school, moved to LA, studied seminary, and then I'll pause there and see where you want to take the conversation.
Yeah. So I'm curious. Tell me about some of the experience with your pals because like you talked a little bit about yours, but like what were some of the things that God was up to that caused this conversion in all of you? Because of course, an orchestrated plan by God to get you guys all on the same page so that you would start making a difference where you were. But can you give me a sense? I mean, what were some of the things that God did during that time?
Well, one common thread I think is just the word relationships. And that's been true in all areas of my life. And when I look at the transformation that took place with these guys in the fraternity, it was very much centered in relational connectivity that we had with one another and people who knew me before Jesus and after Jesus. And they were able to see for themselves and come to their own conclusion after hearing my story of, I want more of what that guy's got, right? And it was all in the context again of like us knowing each other, trusting each other, and the action. They could see the difference for themselves. I didn't have to preach to anybody and say, you should do this or you should do that, right? They could see my story, they could hear my story and live my story. And that was very much my journey as well. It was through relationships with others that I saw things in them that I knew that I was missing from my life.
So you abandon your plans to sorta, as we get into what God ultimately did, as I read, your story, I'm like, He's using all of that, right? It just didn't turn out maybe the way that you thought it would, but you put your plans on hold, you go to seminary, you're thinking pastor. What happened next?
So I ended up meeting the woman who became my wife. I married way up, way out of my league. The Romanian woman who was born in Romania, moved to Detroit when she was 2 because of persecution under communism. She ended up in LA. She was studying seminary. And while we were there, we both thought that we were going to be living in LA for the rest of our lives because we loved it out there, right? But we ended up feeling this very strong sense of calling to the city of Detroit. And before we moved to Detroit, we did what most people do. We moved to Africa for 9 months. And
Okay, sure, everyone does that.
I lived in a mud hut in a Muslim village with no running water. And my job was to be a community developer, which I knew nothing about. But what I knew how to do was listen to people, develop relationships with people, find out what their needs were, and then call my buddies back home to pay for it. And so in the village that we lived in, women were walking a mile and a half each way every day to get water that was about as dirty as it looked like a cup of coffee, really. That's how dark the water was. And the kids were walking 5 miles each way every day to school, which meant very few kids went to school. So we were able to dig a well and get money to pay for building a school building and in that village. And it was really game changing. And that experience actually in Africa really shaped the future for both my wife and I, where we began to see the person of Jesus very differently, where we started to realize that, wow, he spent the majority of his 3 years of ministry with people who were experiencing high levels of marginalization and oppression. And he really wanted his followers to do the same. And, we've concluded that that doesn't mean everyone needs to move into a mud hut or even into, what some might call the hood, but that our time, talent, and resources are often meant to be used while we're here on this earth to really bless those who are experiencing various forms of challenges, right? Of life challenges. And so when we moved into the Detroit area, we started a church in 2007, and we thought we were going to be church planners for the rest of our lives. And so we focused a lot on people experiencing those kinds of hardships and under-resourced neighborhoods. But then in 2010, God gave me this vision to start an organization called Life Remodeled. And it's funny you talk about, in hindsight, how he used all those different experiences, because I didn't even see the connection until 2014 when someone said, "Chris, do you realize you're developing real estate now?"
Yeah.
No,
Oh, yeah.
now that you still are. Wow. Right. And I originally thought we were going to start Life Remodeled and find someone else to run it, and we would keep pastoring and planting churches. But eventually it became really clear that God was actually forming me for that. So I left organizational church ministry in 2014 and just focused specifically on Life Remodeled. And now it's become this very significant citywide transformative effort that we are also now coaching other organizations, both locally and nationally.
Now, I'm curious about, I could always talk about so many things, but one of the things that just stood out to me in what you shared, Chris, is I won't say it exactly like you said, but you felt God guiding you to shift your focus to what you were doing at Life Remodeled. I can imagine someone watching us, listening to us right now thinking, well, that can't be true because we need to be doing it this way, right? But I also heard you say, which I agree is critically important, if we look at Jesus's ministry on earth, he was doing things that made a difference in people's lives. And I know one of your values there at Life Remodeled is community first. So we could argue this is the example that Jesus gave for us, but for the person that may be having a hard time with that, unpack for us, how did God lead you? Like, can you help us tangibly be able to follow? What were some of the things that God did that made it clear to you that this is where you needed to shift your focus?
The way I describe myself is I call myself a follower of Jesus, because I am first and always first a follower before I'm a leader. And for me, I look at that word disciple that Jesus used to talk about who his followers were. And what's a disciple, right? A disciple is a lifelong learner. And so I see myself on a journey as a follower, along with many, 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 millions of other followers like yourself, Tim. And therefore that I don't ever expect to arrive at a place where it's like, oh, now I get it all, right? I went to seminary, I arrived, I got a doctorate in theology, I've arrived. No, if anything, all that journey is done is show me how much how little I know, right? And how much more that I have to learn and to grow. And so much of that journey has actually been learning about my identity in Christ, and also how did our creator, our father, wire me with specific gifts and passions and talents to be able to focus those in the most effective way for his purposes. And so that journey has been one of constantly learning. And the way I have discovered it is I love how Jesus says, he or she who is faithful with little will be given much. And the way I understand that is that, you know, being faithful with a little doesn't mean that you're going to do that exact same thing for the rest of your life. It's that more is to come, more responsibility lies in there. So often when people say, well, how do I find out my calling? How do I find out the big thing that I'm supposed to be doing 10 years from now? I'm like, well, be faithful with the little that you're called today. And for me, what that has meant is I put my entire self into whatever I believe God is calling me to. I'm all in, right? I'm fully present. I'm using all my gifts and talents, and I'm doing it with all my passion and ambition, and always finding a way, right? As you see, another one of our core values. And then that leads to the next thing, and the next thing. And so there's been a lot of self-discovery over the years. And I'll tell you, one of the things I discovered that God has wired me is to be an entrepreneur, or using maybe biblical language, more of like apostolic, right? I also discovered that I'm an evangelist, and in modern day language, that's like being an influencer. That's being someone who tells other people about the good things that they find in life. And first and foremost, for me, that's Jesus and all the other things that have to do with his kingdom. And so I'm a apostolic evangelist. I'm an entrepreneurial sales influential type of person. And that has helped me discover where to focus my time on the things that bring me the most energy, but also that I'm really good at. And that way I can delegate and elevate all the other things. And that means I got to find people that are better than me at those other things that the organization needs, because now I've really discovered I used to spend a lot of time just focusing on what I could do. Now I focus a lot more time on building amazing teams of much smarter people than me. And I find that that's actually even more biblical because it's all about the body working together for specific missions that God has called us on. And so I love organizational structure, not because I love structure, but because I love people and because I love seeing really ambitious visions that God gives us being accomplished.
Wow. And what I heard from what you shared is almost for those that are watching us or listening to us, pay attention to how God has wired you, right? He's going to use even as I hear you sharing, Chris, he's using how he's wired you to things that you're passionate about, that you love doing. You're able to operate in your gifts, your skills and talents. You're not having to be someone else. You're being Chris. And even the desire that he planted in your heart, even though I guess you could argue was somewhat delayed, right? But even that was a godly desire to be able to use real estate and work into that space, right? It's just that how you were going to go about doing it and who was going to benefit from it, right? Because in your first example was about, hey, Chris is going to set himself up for this amazing life. He's going to, it's going to make it rain for him. He's going to have this great life. And that was the desire to get into real estate was good, but he needed to shift your heart a little bit in terms of, well, why am I doing this? But all of it was a part of his plan to get you to this place that you're now doing what you're doing. And that's such just a valuable lesson, I think, for our audiences. Pay attention to how God wired you. He's going to use all those gifts, skills, and talents. Your work can light you up. It's okay to be excited, to be passionate about what you're doing. And that won't always mean, I think this is another important point, it won't always mean that you're operating in traditional environments, doing things that we often think of when we use the word ministry. Because I think when we say ministry, for many people, that equates to I am serving in a church. But I would argue that what you're doing at Life Remodeled, even the work that you're doing, which we'll talk about a little bit more with helping nonprofits improve how they operate, that is also ministry, right? So we sometimes we need to expand our view of how God can work and how he can influence people, because some people may never make it through the church door, but they might encounter you when you're working on a project in their community, and it creates an opportunity for you to show the love of Jesus. And that love, when it is shown, draws people. So thank you so much for sharing that wisdom. So you end up birthing Life Remodeled. Talk to us about the impact, because when I look at the numbers, I spent some time on your website. I'm like, wow. Talk to us about some of the things that God enabled you to do.
Sure. So I also want to add to double down on what you just shared from my own experience. We very intentionally created Life Remodeled as not a religious organization, but for me personally, and for the lot of our team members, it is faith and for most of us, a relationship with Jesus that really drives why we do what we do. And interestingly, I have found that I have been able to share my faith story more frequently and even to greater effect in the work that I'm doing through Life Remodeled than I even was as a church planter and church pastor. And I think it has a lot to do with people are so inspired by the action of the work that they often ask, why do you do it? Or how do you do that? And the reality is there's no version of that story without the person of Jesus at the center of it for me, right? Now that's not the case for everybody who's a part of our work. And I often look back again to like, that's also how Jesus did his work. He invited the 12 disciples to kick out demons and to raise people from the dead and all this stuff, even before they were fully believers. I think we could both agree that Judas probably wasn't a believer, but I actually don't believe any of the 12 were fully believers until Jesus's resurrection. And yet they got to do the work with them even before they were really, all in. But when it comes to the impact, so Life Remodeled, let me start with why Life Remodeled exists, what Life Remodeled does, and the impact that we've had. So we believe that Detroit residents have all the talent they need, but many don't have access to all the opportunities they deserve. And so when I talk about that gap in opportunity, three stats come to mind right now. 88% of third grade students in Detroit are reading below grade level. That's significant. 30% of Detroiters can't even access the healthcare they need. And Detroit residents' median household income is half that of suburban residents. And so what we do is we revitalize neighborhoods to really accomplish three things: to improve academic outcomes, to increase access to health and wellness services, and help more Detroiters achieve economic self-sufficiency through new sustainable livable wage employment. The way we do that is we repurpose large vacant school buildings into what we call one-stop hubs of opportunity for community thriving. We fill these buildings with the best and brightest nonprofits that are doing those three things that I just mentioned. And then we help them collaborate to produce very ambitious outcomes and impact that none of us would have been capable of achieving alone. So it's very much a team collaborative effort with the neighborhood, with other great organizations. When it comes to some of the impact we've been able to achieve, I'll start with when we started in 2010, and I'll say our first 4 years were very, very rocky and messy. And I'm happy to talk about my many, many failures. And look, I've still got failures today, so it's not like those are only in rearview mirror, right? But our impact shifted pretty significantly in 2014, and over the last 10 years, we've been able to invest $51 million into Detroit neighborhoods. We've renovated 4 school buildings. We're currently renovating our 5th right now, and we mobilized 82,000 volunteers. We beautified 2,300 city blocks, and the most recent school building that we repurposed serves 25,000 people a year. And that neighborhood now has literally the lowest crime in all of Detroit. It had one of the highest crime rates when we started that project in 2017. Gallup Research also did a survey in the whole city of Detroit last year, and their research concluded that that neighborhood, out of all neighborhoods in Detroit, has the second highest perception of their ability to thrive based on the specific neighborhood they lived in. And so some very, very ambitious outcomes have been achieved, some of them that we weren't even planning for, and even exceeded our strategy and our plans. And so, yeah, we give God all the credit for that. And there's some principles that, we don't just sit down and expect God to do it all, right? He's given us vision. He's given us the fact that we need team. He's given us, the gift of administration and actually having a plan, right? And implementing it with discipline and execution. And so we've learned a lot along the way, and we still got more to learn.
So I think it is going to be helpful for our audience because you're able to speak now from a place of experience to say, hey, here are some things that you want to implement in your nonprofit so that it can be successful. And often the way that we figure those things out is through going through those rocky experiences that you talked about. So because some of the people in our viewing and listening audience might be there right now, can you give us a picture of what that 4-year period before it kind of took off? What were some of the things that were happening then, and what did you learn through that experience?
I had no idea how to attract and develop and retain top tier talent. So when we hired people for our organization, if they weren't already what we might call rock stars or A players who could independently overcome their own challenges, I had no idea how to help them grow and develop. I didn't know how to build the caliber of team that we have today. When it came to strategic planning, we had one. It looked good on paper, but we were not operationalizing it. We were not actually bringing that to fruition. And we created a big wake. We ended up, cycling through a lot of different people because we lacked structure. We lacked the ability to develop great team members. And I look back on that and I say, I really wish I would have known then what I know now. And so I consider that my responsibility as the founder and CEO to know those things. And so I take, responsibility and accountability for those things. And that's what's driven me to be so passionate to help people avoid many of the same mistakes. And so I would say the bigger thing that probably resonates with all of us is there was a major gap between the vision that God had given us and our ability to actually deliver on that. And all of us want the tools and resources to be able to be impactful.
Oh, yeah. So you're not sure how to bring in the right talent. Doesn't sound like you had kind of the structure in place that you have today. Gap between the vision and the reality. So was it this moment where it all clicked for you and you knew all these things on the other side of the other 4 years? Or was there an intentional process that you went through? For some people, sometimes that's books. I had this mentor. I plugged into this group. What was that like for you?
So it all started when somebody handed me a book in 2014 that's called Traction. It's written by one of my favorite authors who's a friend of mine, Gino Wickman. And this book was the first book that I'd seen that really simplified very complex organizational concepts into a series of tools that were very, very easy to implement. Now, the first time I read this book, one of my first thoughts was somebody needs to translate these principles into the nonprofit sector because I knew how to translate them, being that I came from business school and now I'm on the other side of it. But the other thing that happened was to really implement these tools, you needed to hire one of their consultants. And the consultancy is called EOS, which some of our listeners are going to be familiar. It's a very, very popular business consultancy, and I love it to this day. But the challenge for us was the cost of a really great implementer was like $50,000 or more a year. So I said, forget that. I'm going to self-implement. And we self-implemented and we grew very, very rapidly. And we started translating these tools into our own context. But then in 2019, we were actually able to get access to one of their amazing implementers. And we grew so much further, so much faster that I actually looked back and I lamented over all the years that we tried to do it ourselves. And I said, I wish I would have found a way to hire you a long time ago, because for a while I was operating under a scarcity mentality that like, oh, we can't spend resources on a guide, an implementer. It's a waste of money, whatever. However, as I told you, I'm an evangelist for all good things, most importantly, Jesus. I literally tried to convince over 100 nonprofits to implement EOS, and I'm not exaggerating when I say that. And every single one neglected to follow through with what I was trying to convince them to do. And I learned there were two very common reasons why everyone said no to me. Number one was the business language of EOS and all the other great systems that are out there. There's actually dozens of business operating systems out there. And I could get most people past hurdle number one because most nonprofit leaders I know don't come from the business sector. And a lot of them actually stiff arm the business world because they label it as exploitative and they kind of throw out the baby with the bathwater, right? If I could get people past hurdle number one, I could not get them past hurdle number two, which was the cost of an implementer. So that led me and our team at Life Remodeled to say, forget it. We're not going to try to convince anybody to implement these business systems. We're just going to create a system that's truly for nonprofits. And it's kind of like if you think of mission work in a foreign country, right? If we go to a foreign country that doesn't speak English and we try to implement some great, gospel or technology speaking English, we're only going to get so far. But if you start speaking the language of the culture, you're going to get a lot farther. And so I wrote a book called Next Level Nonprofit. And we've created this system that we coach organizations in. And the book is written in a way that you could absolutely self-implement it anywhere in the world and hundreds of organizations have already started implementing these tools since the book was published last year in June. But you're going to go a lot further faster if you hire one of our coaches, right? And so we make the coaching far more affordable. We've got a lot of why-driven people, very passion-driven people behind it. But the simple version is this, right? There's 4 key components of the system: team unity, compelling vision, right strategy, discipline execution. And we break those 4 components down into very simple tools to help people achieve them.
Let's talk about the first one, because in my research, preparing for our conversation, I saw an article about your journey with Life Remodeled and a recognition that I need a leadership team that reflects the community that I serve. So talk to us a little bit about that. I don't want to give it all away. Talk to us about the epiphany that you came to, and then if you can translate, how does that impact others? Because everyone's situation is a little different, but I think there probably are some nuggets in there for our leaders that are watching us today.
Yeah, I'm going to say the foundation of all organizational success is the right people in the right seats becoming a united team. And for us who are Jesus followers, okay, having Jesus at the center of that, right? That's the not so secret sauce that really is really transformational. And again, God doesn't just do this work for us; He does it through us. And having a united team of the right people in the right seats is the whole foundation. Now, specifically in line with what you asked, that was something that took me a while to learn, because I live in the city of Detroit. Okay, Detroit is the largest predominantly Black city in America. Right now, about 75 to 76 of our city identify as Black Americans, or some would call African American, whatever terminology someone feel comfortable. But most Detroiters like to just go by Black, right? And what really stood out to me is I witnessed one white person like myself after another trying to say and do things in environments like Detroit schools that had only a limited impact. But when I would see an African-American leader or Black leader say the same thing, I saw it have far greater impact. And one of the things I saw is for a lot of children in Detroit schools, or even adult, when they would see a white person, they might think to themselves, that doesn't apply to me because I'm not white, right? And I began to realize why there were elements of where that was true. There was such a thing as white privilege and realities of how people looked at someone if they were African American. But I know we could debate that all different ways, and I'm not here to debate white privilege and whatnot. But I will say this: what really convinced me is the person of Jesus deciding to become a human. And God did not have to do that. He could have just stayed in heaven and wrote in the clouds the gospel, or just, dropped the Bible out of heaven or whatever. But he became a human being to relate to us so we could truly understand the character and the competency of God in a way that made sense to us. We had to see a human, right? Feel and touch someone who looked like us. And so when I think of any type of ministry, I'll go back to foreign ministry. It's always more effective when people who grew up in that culture and context are leading the way. Always, 100 times out of 100, right? And so when I'm doing work in Detroit, it's like, it's foolish for me to think that this should be done by a bunch of white people who didn't grow up in this context, right? I mean, but there's room for people who look like me to be involved in the work. Obviously, God calls us to these places and spaces, and I'm all about what's going to be most effective, right? And so what I learned is that it was very difficult to find African American or Black leaders that were the most talented people in our organization. And here's what's crazy about that: Detroit is loaded with talent. This is the largest predominantly Black city in America. But people weren't applying for our jobs when we would post them. And then it hit me. I saw an article on LinkedIn that 80% of jobs were acquired through relationships. And I realized that is the missing piece. I don't have enough relational capital in predominantly Black spaces. And so I started going to Black churches. I started going to predominantly Black events where often I was the only white guy in the room. And I started developing very deep, meaningful relationships to where I gained a lot of trust, right? And these were authentic relationships. And now all of a sudden, way more African American people started applying for our jobs, and now we're hiring the best and brightest, and they're Black leaders, right? I don't believe in tokenism. Nobody wants that, right? Nobody wants to be on the side of that, and so we don't have like a rule where somebody has to be Black to work here, right? But I'm unashamedly, when I'm looking to fill a position, I want to find all kinds of applicants. And I want to find people who look like, and not just skin, I'm not talking about the outer, I'm talking about culture. I'm talking about people who've had the lived experiences of the people that we're serving. I grew up in a small town in northern Indiana, Tam. I can't relate to some
Yeah.
of the experiences that people have had. And so that's okay. But it's better when I find people who can.
I think what's awesome about that is, one, your humility to realize, hey, maybe there's a different way to do this. And then being willing to put yourself in environments that you hadn't been in as consistently before, like being the only white person in those spaces, like that could have been a new thing. And it sounds like you were doing it a lot, but to me, it shows me how sold out you were, how all in you were on, we need to do what is right by this, the city, the community that we're serving. And the right thing to do, because we want to get them results, is to have people in place that they're actually going to respond to, and it's going to resonate when they communicate. And you are intentional to make sure that you have leaders that reflect the community in position, and you are working in concert together. So it's not, hey, I'm going to just sit over here and do this, and I'm going to let them run it. It wasn't like you resigned and said, okay, we need to make sure that everyone that is in this organization is Black. No, we can work together. And I'm sure that you learn from them, because they did grow up in the culture, and then they are learning some things from you, from your experiences, from how God has wired you, the places that he's had you in the States and out. So I love that, because it's an example of how we can work together from different cultures. We didn't talk about this, but we can work together even if we have different political associations. Like, we can come together. And I think that's a very important message in this day and age, because there's so much division. There's so much othering is a term that I hear used a lot. And I just have so much appreciation for your willingness to be a bridge, instead of saying, hey, I'm going to stay over here. Or you could have said, we tried and it didn't work. No one's applying. I've heard that before. But you said, no, no one's applying, but what can we do about it? And I guess that goes back to one of the values, always find a way. Let's talk about vision, Chris. Talk us through, kind of just like you did with the team unity piece. What's the key about vision?
Yeah, so I'll tie that into strategic planning, because here's what I found, and these are two extremes, right? Not everybody fits within these two extremes, but I've seen these two radical distinctions when it comes to strategic planning in the nonprofit sector. Scenario number one is a nonprofit doesn't have a strategic plan, and that's typically smaller organizations. Scenario number two is they have a plan, they hired a consultant, paid him a lot of money, and they came up with this beautiful 10-page, usually longer strategic plan that nobody in the organization knows what's actually in there. And it's doing a great job sitting on a shelf collecting dust. But when a funder comes over, they pull it out, they say, look, we have a strategic plan, right? And usually that plan is full of a lot of fluffy, great statements where there's no clear accountabilities to who is going to do what by when, and what are the expected outcomes. Now, since we're in a Jesus-centered context, what I often see is pushback in Christian communities to strategic planning, because we say, hey, we got to make sure the left hand doesn't know what the right hand is doing. hey, we got to leave everything up to God. And so we take a very reactive approach to ministry where we just do whatever, someone comes to our door and we respond in a million different ways. And I want to say this, I don't want to mock that kind of ministry. And I don't want to be against that. If that's what God is calling you to do, I support you and your ministry 110%. I think there's plenty of room for that style of reactive ministry where you don't have a clearly defined mission, vision, values, right? And that's cool. You just need to know that that way of doing things is going to lead to certain kinds of non-measurable outcomes that may take you a million different places. There's a guy named Bob Goff that wrote a book called Love Wins, and that's like kind of how he lives his life, like he literally gives his cell phone out to everyone who read the book, and people call him up and he just kind of responds. Um, Although, just like you said though earlier, Tam, that God has wired people in very specific ways for very specific things. Here's what I believe. I believe he's done the same thing with organizations, that he calls specific organizations to specific niche visions. Now, that means that we need to collaborate and work together, because I believe that no one nonprofit or ministry is designed to solve all of society's ailments. I believe that we all need each other, and we're all called to focus on specific pieces of the challenge, right? And so what I'm passionate about is organizations discerning from God, what is that vision? Where is he calling them to go? And how do you get there? And I believe in a principle of strategic planning that all of those business operating systems I mentioned or alluded to earlier, they all use. It's really a 2-page strategic plan where page 1 answers the question, where are we going? And page 2 answers the question, how do we get there? And it starts with discerning, what is God calling your organization to do? That's your mission, right? Why, what, how? What is the 10-year moonshot that he's giving you? So when I say 10-year moonshot, I'm literally alluding to in the 1960s, when President Kennedy said, we're going to go to the moon and back. We're going to put a person on the moon and bring them back safely to Earth before the decade's over. And when that statement was made, we need to know that that was ludicrous, because the technology did not even exist to achieve that mission. And we didn't even know the math of how to get the mission to safely to Earth. And hey, we've seen the movie Hidden Figures, and it was actually Black women who played a huge role in discovering that math. But what we did is we set out a vision that was achievable. It was ambitious. It was realistic. We didn't say we're going to go to Mars or to the sun, which would be impossible. But we worked backwards from that vision, and we learned what we need to learn to discover the math, to create the technology that would create the technology that would create the technology that eventually got us to the moon and back. And so when I hear organizations have visions for the future, and people say things like, we envision a world by the year 2030 where no one is hungry, I loathe that statement unless you have a plan to achieve it. Because I don't believe in just, saying these things that we have no real plan to achieve, because then we're inoculating people against vision and accountability. But I do believe God has radical, ambitious, moonshot-sized visions. And the way we achieve those is what does it look like 10 years from now? What would it look like 3 years from now for us to be on track to hit that moonshot? What do we need to do over the next year to be on track? And then what do we need to do over the next 90 days? And so when we do strategic planning, we teach organizations to break that down into 90-day bites, or what you call quarterly priorities, that eventually every team member throughout the entire organization becomes aligned with a strategic plan, and they prioritize, what are the 3 to 7 most important things I got to do over the next 90 days to keep us on track to hit our moonshot? And that doesn't mean things won't change or things like COVID won't happen or what, but the teams that are most prepared for the future, they pivot the quickest and most effectively.
Amen. I love it. I love it. I love it. We're going to make sure that our listening audience is able to get their hands on the book. and is able to partner with you to kind of unpack these things so that they can achieve the results that God has for them, right? So God has allowed you, the team at Life Remodeled, to do some amazing things. But you that are watching us, that are listening to us right now, God has a plan for you and the impact that you are to create. So, what we want to do is just help you with the tools, the resources, the people that can help you get there. So, we're going to make sure that you know exactly if you follow the link in the show notes, you'll make sure that you get you connected with Chris. I'm always amazed at how quickly time goes, Chris. So I've got to get you out of here. Let's do a couple of quick things before we wrap up. We've talked about so many things. Someone is probably listening to us, watching us right now. They're really inspired by what you're saying. They're even going to take the step to get their hands on the book. But what can they do right now? What is your number one piece of advice after they finish listening to this episode? What would you encourage a leader to do to start putting some of what we've talked about into practice?
Wow, I mean, there's so many ways we could go about this. I guess the thing I want to leave people with is the scripture where Jesus says that he's going to build his church and the gates of hell won't prevail against it, which means that we're made to go on the offensive. We're made to go out there and take on as ambitious journeys. And so I just want to leave people with that reminder that, like what you just said, God has something gigantic for us, and it's going to take training up and having a lifelong learning posture of a follower, even before we see ourselves as leaders.
Love that. Love that. Agree 100%. Let's talk about legacy. So many things that God has allowed you to experience. When I read about and I hear you unpack your story with us today, but we're believing there's still, years to come, more impact for you to make at Life Remodeled, more even beyond that. Maybe there's some desires that God has placed in your heart that He's going to allow you to walk out in this coming season. But just like you've walked us through, hey, here are the things that organizations need to do to be successful. You kind of identify those four buckets. I think when we reflect on our life, Chris, we can say, hey, here are the things that I want to leave behind. Here are the things that I want to be remembered for. Here's the tangible difference that I want to create, the theme, if you will, of my life. For you, what is that?
I guess I've done that tombstone exercise. What would you want written on your tombstone? Two words: all in. And hey, we're coming up on football season now, right? Which I'm excited about. And we all have heard the saying of like, wow, that player at the end of the game, we know he or she left it all on the field, right? When I'm going from here, that's what I want people to confidently be able to say, that I didn't hold anything back. Yeah, I made plenty of mistakes. I failed forward because I lived a lifestyle. I'm all in all day, every day. And that doesn't mean constantly working. That means all in on rest and Sabbath and
Mm,
identity.
that's
But
good.
it really is just about a heart posture that we're totally surrendered to the way of Jesus.
Chris, thank you for spending your time with us, for sharing your wisdom. Certainly, we'll be praying with you as you move forward into this next season with Life Remodeled and the works that you're doing with the nonprofits. It's been a blessing to learn from you and to spend this time with you. We certainly wish you God's best as you move forward.
Blessings on you and your work and all those that you're reaching with your great content. And I'm looking forward to following you more. So thank you for the opportunity to be here today.